Greetings, friends of liberty. It came to my attention recently at Almacks, whilst discussing the question of the desirability of regulating the rate of interest charged by banks, usually too serious a topic for most of the gaming tables, that only a few years past, Adam Smith of Wealth of Nations fame, and Jeremy Bentham, he of the philosophic calculus, discussed this very point, since being of two entirely different minds on the issue. Smith, on the one hand, thought that if interest rates were free and not capped at, let us imagine, 6% by the state, then persons whom he called prodigals, those who, like the prodigal son, spend thoughtlessly, would throw their money away. In addition, secondly, those whom he called projectors, schemers and quacks ready to take advantage of the prodigals by advertising useless projects, would do so, and thus these two groups would waste all their money, rendering society less well off. Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian, on the other hand, disagreed, pointing out that the crux of the biscuit, as they say, is that no difference in reality exists between the price of money and the price of anything else. And so, to be consistent, Smith would have to advocate controlling the price of everything, since quacks can be found selling anything for a high price. Secondly, Bentham argued that a prodigal son prevented from borrowing could simply sell his possessions to get the money to finance his prodigality directly. In other words, by preventing him from borrowing, you would merely encourage him to sell sooner rather than later. And finally, Bentham pointed out that by assuming that all projectors were quacks, instead of in some cases those wisely offering investments that promised high rewards, this would damage the ability of England to discover and implement risky new technologies of great potential benefit. I must say I heartily concur with Jeremy's argument, and for what it's worth, vouch for its soundness. However, if we turn to the issue of whether the state should control the rate of interest for whatever reason and by whatever means in your own 21st century, we find today's journalist, economic historian, and investment banker Edward Chancellor delivering an all-encompassing tour de force describing exactly what has happened throughout world history when governments have tried this. Of course, the 20th and 21st centuries being what they are, this regulation of interest has employed orders of magnitude greater control via the institution of central reserve banking than Adam Smith ever contemplated in the late 18th century when he merely proposed outlawing loan shark interest rates. Chancellor begins his epic recounting by setting a dramatic tableau. Paris, 1849. The champions of two opposed schools of economic thought address each other in the pages of La Voix du Peuple. On the one hand stands Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, representing a fusion of anarchy and socialism, who believes that the downfall and death of societies are due to the power of accumulation possessed by property, and on the other, that champion of economic freedom, Frederick Bastiat. Proudhon, not surprisingly, with regard to interest, believed that a national bank should be established, with money loaned out from it at close to 0% interest, much like today when governments often do the same. Bastiat, on the other hand, argued that interest wasn't theft, but a fair reward for a mutual exchange of services. The lender provides the use of capital for a period of time, and time has value. With regard to Proudhon's idea of a national bank with free money, he replied, "When a rich man presents himself at the bank, he will be told, You are a solvent. Here is the capital. We lend it to you for nothing. But let a worker dare to show his face. He will be asked, where are your guarantees, your lands, your houses, your goods? And so this national bank, Bastiat argued, would actually treat workers unfairly and unjustly increase inequality, contrary to Proudhon's claims. That, too, seems familiar today. Next, after ironically noting and briefly describing to us the ways in which, after the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy in September 2008, the results were not as Proudhon anticipated, but rather Bastiat's grim forebodings appeared closer to the truth, Chancellor then gives us an increasing familiarization with the concept of interest by proceeding historically. He states, number 1, in the beginning was the loan, and the loan carried interest. So among ancient farming communities or civilizations such as the Sumerian, when one loaned cattle to a neighbor for a period of time, since the cattle would eventually give birth, it was only just to receive back some or all of the calves they bore, regarded as a form of interest. This practice lasted even into the 19th century with the terms that double the number transferred is to be returned in 4 or 5 years. Number 2, Chancellor says that our understanding of early finance arises thanks to the Mesopotamians, who recorded their loans on clay tablets, and who invented what Einstein supposedly called the eighth wonder of the world, compound interest. With the Mesopotamians, the state set the rates, 20% for loans of silver, 33% for barley. The Greeks charged 10%, the Romans, at least officially, 8%. Of course, as Chancellor says, the attempt by financial practitioners to evade regulation turns out to be as old as the law itself. Number 3, loans given out in temples, a common practice, were often at a lower rate to those provided by private individuals. This may be an early example of subsidized public lending, or perhaps the temples attracted a better class of debtor. After all, no one wants to default to a god. Number 4, one obvious component of interest, rates, of course, is the risk premium. So, for example, among the Babylonians, rates could be as high as 40% on high-risk sailing voyages. Number 5, Chancellor points out that there is little or no correlation historically between high growth rates of a country, economy, or period and interest rates. There have been high and low interest rates all throughout recorded history, while at the same time large variations in GDP. He also notes that the trend in interest rates in Babylon, Greece, and Rome followed a pattern, declining as each civilization became established and prospered, but rising sharply during periods of decline and fall. Number 6, when we look for moral attitudes towards the taking of interest, we see, of course, a great range. So, for example, Aristotle thought that money was intended to be used in exchange, but not to increase at interest, and that usury is of all modes of making money the most unnatural. Aquinas said that interest violates the law of the just price by taking back more than originally handed over. Number 7, the Catholic and religious rationalizations of the medieval period condemning interest also can be seen in the theologian Thomas Cobham, who in the 14th century argued that, since time belonged to God, anyone charging interest is benefiting from using time, which is God's property, not his own. Thus, he is a thief of time. Number 8, the great Renaissance merchant and banker Francesco Dettini, as well as many other contemporary financiers, found numerous ways to get around church law. As Chancellor says, northern Italian bankers concealed interest behind euphemisms, such as yield, gain, reward, rent, profit, fee, and foregone benefit. Number 9, Reaching the French economist Turgot in 1770, we find another component of interest understood, namely time preference. Turgot says it is the difference in usefulness which exists at the date of borrowing between a sum currently owned and an unequal sum which is to be received at a distant date. So in other words, if you value $100 now, the same as $106 in a year, we know your time preference. One famous later study of time preference conducted by Walter Mischel at Stanford, called the marshmallow test, found that the 200 children out of 600 who were able to wait 15 minutes to get an extra marshmallow were somewhat more successful in life than the other 400. The Austrian School of Economics in particular regards time preference as central, with theorist Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk saying, "The natural difference in value between present and future goods is the fountainhead from which all interest takes its origin." Number 10. Both Austrians Böhm-Bawerk and Friedrich Hayek, the later Nobel Prize winner, made the following crucial point about interest rates. This is key to understanding the Austrian notion of the business cycle. Hayek said, when interest rates decline, businesses are inclined to invest in projects with more distant payoffs. If interest rates are kept below their natural level, misguided investments occur. Too much time is used in production, or put another way, the investment returns don't justify the initial outlay. So in other words, if a central bank, such as the Federal Reserve, lowers the interest rate below the average interest rate of the population, then businessmen will be fooled into starting investments which won't be completed in time before the loans come due. If this effect is widespread enough throughout an economy, Austrians believe that this can cause a crash, which is how they would explain the Great Depression and Great Recession. Let's now transition to another major focus, which is on central banks and the enormous damage they've wrought for over a century now with their monetary manipulations. No more suitable introduction could be tendered than by outlining the course of one of the greatest bubbles ever blown on our own dear French neighbors by that Scottish rogue, John Law. Law, at age 23, lost his inheritance by gambling, then won a duel, but not receiving a royal pardon for his opponent's death, fled to the continent where, with his charm and his extraordinary head for numbers, convinced Louis XV's regent to let him become finance minister in 1716. Creating a national bank in 1718, he subsequently blew a huge bubble in the French economy, partly by speculation in land in Mississippi, by issuing enormous amounts of paper money, but then, when the actual gold and silver backing up the paper was not enough, Law trying to prevent people by law from converting the paper money to gold and silver, the bubble crashed. Law was notable not only for his brilliance in deceiving everyone, but for modeling the same type of banking system that exists throughout the world today. That, of course, bodes ill for Western civilization, since it is only a matter of time before many countries, living beyond their fiscal means by printing so much money, will go bankrupt. It is, ironically, the reemergence of that very prodigal character that so worried Adam Smith, but now in the much more dangerous form in the hands of a prodigal government. As economist Peter Gaber summarized, Law's type of system is the centerpiece of most money and macroeconomics textbooks produced in the last 2 generations. Or as William Gutzman put it, Law's belief that too little money constrains economic activity is the essential principle underlying the decisions by the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank today. Not reassuring. As Chancellor says, what have been the results of using the same methods that John Law did to the French? As Richard Cantillon put it all the way back in 1730, 10 years after Law wrought his destruction, the newly created money is initially trapped within the financial system, where it inflates financial assets rather than consumer prices, and only slowly seeps out into the wider economy. Sound familiar? As Chancellor notes, Law's banking successors have been Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, and Mario Draghi, head of the European Central Bank. Chancellor next steps us into the 19th century and that brilliant editor of The Economist, Walter Bagehot. Bagehot indicated his understanding of the danger of low interest rates by his phrase, "John Bull can stand many things, but he cannot stand 2% interest." 2%. What he meant by that was, when interest rates are that low, people are tempted to speculate because they can't get much return from their savings. Bagehot was also known for spreading the belief that the Bank of England should function as a lender of last resort during times of financial crisis. It's not surprising, in this respect then, that Ben Bernanke, head of the Federal Reserve from 2006 to 2014, mentions Bagehot more frequently than any other economist, although Chancellor argues that Bagehot would have been much stricter as Fed chairman than Ben was. Chancellor next brings us forward to the 20th century and begins delineating the greatest bubble ever blown, the American stock market of the Roaring '20s. He details how, number one, the gold standard then in effect had enforced fiscal discipline on central banks since they had no choice but to raise interest rates when gold left the country. That was very healthy. After World War I, it was replaced with a modified gold exchange standard, which wasn't as stringent in maintaining the ratio of gold reserves. So central bankers could fiddle more. All this had been enabled in the U.S. when in 1914 the money supply was theoretically loosened by the Federal Reserve Act, which disconnected the interest rate from the necessity of converting paper money into gold or silver. Number two, in 1921, during what James Grant calls the Forgotten Depression, the Fed, contrary to its present easy money policy, sharply raised interest rates when prices rose to crush inflation, thereby also bringing a brief and needed recession. The country quickly recovered from this. Number three, the Federal Reserve, in order to prevent deflation of general prices, which was somehow regarded as bad, increased the money supply by reducing interest rates 1.5% in 1924. Some people worried about this. For example, Benjamin Anderson, chief economist at Chase National Bank, believed that monetary policy was too loose. This loose monetary policy continued all the way until 1928, by which time bank credit in the United States more than doubled. Much of the new lending was not employed by industry but went to finance stock loans, real estate mortgages, and the purchase of foreign securities. Thousands of new banks were chartered to provide credit facilities for real estate promotions. Number four, when the crash of '29 finally came, of the economists we've surveyed, which ones lost money? Irving Fisher, most famous perhaps of all American economists and originator of modern macroeconomics and econometrics, lost his personal fortune. And John Maynard Keynes, who was worshipped as Jesus himself by many American economists over the next half century. And whose portfolio did not decline? Felix Sommery, a Swiss banker who had studied with the Austrians in Vienna, or those Austrians themselves, Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, who knew what was coming, partly because the Austrians understood that deflation of prices was a good thing and should be allowed, since it brings about a reduction in the cost of living. Thus, Hayek in particular understood that targeting price stabilization, or a flat level of prices, was not a good thing, but a warning indicator in the 20s, because with the alleged increased productivity of the 20s, prices should have been decreasing. But, just like today, the Fed had attempted to keep prices stable or rising by a loose monetary policy, thus creating a catastrophe. So having shown us in depth the examples of how low interest rates caused John Law's Mississippi bubble, and the Fed's Great Depression, Chancellor brings us through the modern era and into the present by showing how, number one, Japan lost 2 decades of economic growth from the 90s on by the ultra-low interest rate policy of the Bank of Japan, partly because it evergreened or rolled over the bad loans of their zombie banks and businesses. The perverse result was to give bad companies and businesses more money than the good companies. Well done. Number 2, Fed Chairman Paul Volcker crushed the out-of-control inflation in the U.S. by raising interest rates to the now unimaginable height of 20%, which no modern Fed chairman would have the courage to attempt, bringing inflation down from about 14.8% in 1979 to under 3% in 1981. Number 3, Silicon Valley loves Fed funny money, with which it creates lots of useless tech startups and unicorn companies like Elizabeth Holmes's Theranos. Number 4, with the advent of Alan Greenspan, Fed chief from 1987 to 2006, and his so-called Greenspan put, which inaugurated the modern era of easy money, came the dot-com boom and bust and the run-up to the Great Recession. Number 5, many central bankers and modern economists after the Great Recession made excuses exculpating their easy money policies or theories, which had led to inflating housing markets around the world. In the case of Larry Summers, citing secular stagnation, or in the case of Ben Bernanke, claiming that too much savings in China was the reason. As Chancellor says, the inadequacy of their models meant that nearly every central banker was caught off guard by the subprime crisis. Number 6, with the subsequent low interest rate policies, often close or even below zero, that came after the Great Recession, savers were unable to make any money on their savings, which is highly destructive of long-term economic growth and productive investment. Number 7, China over the last 30 years, with its overconstruction of housing and infrastructure of all kinds, is a classic example of a central bank inflating an economy and misallocating resources, exactly as the Austrians would predict. Right now, many bubbles appear to be bursting, among them their housing and stock market bubbles. Number 8, and finally, he shows us how the dollar, as the world's reserve currency, exacerbates the problem, since the counterproductive policies of the easy money Fed can thus be easily spread through it to the entire world. This book is comprehensive, humorous, and well-written and researched, and although a bit long, I would give it an A-. One note of caution, however, should be raised in that sometimes Chancellor appears to imply that all economic problems are due to easy money, when obviously there may be either other macro factors or even local factors involved. So, for example, Thomas Sowell, in his book The Housing Boom and Bust, outlined the existence of other macro factors, such as the government-sponsored entities Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and local factors in California and Nevada, such as the land use restrictions that made land there much more expensive before a house was even built. These macro and local factors had nothing to do with interest rates. For anyone who likes this book and is serious about research, I would recommend the website of the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, and the publication papers found there by economists William White and Claudio Borio. One great 38-page paper by White is entitled Ultra-Easy Monetary Policy and the Law of Unintended Consequences. Written in 2012, it essentially functions as a summary of the arguments in this book. Very happy for my part that my Blakeney ancestors, having made some investments in France during John Law's bubble there, sold them just in the nick of time at the peak of the bubble, for which I remain thankful to this day. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.